Welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington. Autumn is here with its darkening days, and with them come the inspiration to turn inward and indulge our imaginations. I'm here in the studio with Rick Kleffel, host of Narrative Species, to take you through a spine-tingling tour of chilling and creepy tales to evoke the Halloween spirit. Rick's show airs every Friday at 5 p.m., and it's also podcasted. He has episodes stretching all the way back to 2002, and his guests run the gamut from world-renowned bestsellers to Pulitzer Prize winners, as well as the rare gems you might never have caught wind of without Rick's keen eye for the grand tale. We thought Halloween would be particularly rich for running amok through the imaginal realm, and so tonight we are going to creep into the library, pull back the cobwebs from dust-covered shelves, and share some great reading recommends to put shivers down your spine while lighting up your literary brain, which we hope is not in a jar awaiting Dr. Frankenstein. Well, Rick, thank you so much for joining us here on Talk of the Bay.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Christine, for inviting me.
Yeah. So this is our second time we're doing one of these grand tours on a theme. We did one of these last Christmas season. Well, it wasn't Christmas. It was really a winter-themed show. And tonight, it's going to be creepy. I really enjoyed looking up these books and authors. But now I want to turn the show over to you. We're going to zoom through about 9 or 10 books and authors. Who are we starting out with?
We'll start out with Ben Percy. About a year ago, he started a trilogy, the Comet Trilogy. He has just released the final novel in the series called The Sky Vault. Now, we all hear about, the science fiction novel generally has the comet crash into the earth and cause a lot of problems.
She's wished her husband.
Percy has done something very different, and I really like the idea. The idea is that the comet goes past the sun, near the Earth, but through the Earth's orbit. A year later, the Earth passes through the debris of the comet, and a bunch of space junk falls on the Earth, and it changes the Earth forever. In the first novel, The Ninth Metal, where we locate in Minnesota, where giant chunks of a new metal fall called omnium. It's a metal that allows incredible advances in civilization and technology and changes the world all by itself. In the second novel, The Unfamiliar Garden, we go to Seattle, where people have discovered a new fungus, and it's much more than a mushroom, let me tell you. The final novel takes place in Alaska. It's called The Sky Vault. It begins with a DJ at a radio station.
Ooh, how perfect.
He's on a plane, and he sees some clouds, very unusual clouds, and what disturbs him greatly is that he sees tentacles coming down from the clouds. Other people don't, but he's quickly whisked away, and then we join a woman who's been made an offer she can't refuse by the U.S. government to rebuild a secret weapons facility that was shut down after World War II. And what follows pulls the other three books together, gives an explanation for what the heck is going on and behind all these books, but also leaves the world wide open to explore in this post-comet world. And it is scary and weird. I have a clip of Ben, and you can hear his voice. It gives an idea what the book's like. So we'll just let it rock.
All right, let's hear it. Okay.
She's wished her husband dead before. Isn't that what all wives wish occasionally about their husbands? A spin out on a country highway, an aneurysm at the gym, a bit of ham clogged in a windpipe. Something quick, something that allowed you a fresh start. It was a wish you made without believing it would actually come true. He had that frat boy charm, but underneath it was something rank, a surface different than his center. Maybe that was the case with everybody. It was definitely the case with North Fall. Take one look and you think you're in a piney postcard advertising vacation land. Blink a few times and you realize you're in the middle of an alien or geopolitical crisis.
Oh, it's so close to kind of how life feels anyway, except this has that supernatural cosmic edge, and he is an interesting sounding man.
Well, what he does with this book is he uses the comet to kind of externalize the conflicts that we're having in a really interesting and imaginative way. With Omnium, it's really a lot about the oil rush because there's an omnium rush.
Right.
And with the unexpected garden, it's about chemical weaponry and what we're doing to the world that's changing the life that grows beneath our feet in perhaps ways we would prefer not to have happen. The third book gives us a look at history, the history of technology that reaches back to World War II, those old A-bomb tests. The idea being that maybe what was happening out in New Mexico with Oppenheimer and Trinity wasn't the only thing we were trying to do.
Right?
Exactly. And he writes, if our readers like Stephen King, and then these are the books for you. You will tear through them. You'll feel you're right like in King country, except for it's the entire country. And you'll get to see the whole world go to hell in a really imaginative and entertaining way, much more so than the current one.
Why is it that when we're reading fiction, it's just such a different atmosphere, a different feeling around all these tragedies? Maybe it gives us that feeling of being more omniscient or all-powerful because we're reading about it and we're not exactly living it.
Well, I think it's very interesting because I think horror fiction in particular really has a boom during the economic and geopolitical hard times. And I think you're right, because when you're reading in a book, it's different, and it also allows you to, in the book, sometimes at least, the evils are, conquered.
Right. There's always that hope, like in the end, it'll all work out in the end.
It might work. Maybe the author of this world really likes us too. And Ben Percy just does such an outstanding job at, taking the real world and grounding us in characters we really, really care about, and then putting them in places we don't want them to be, and we want to see them escape, and also seeing them, use human ingenuity. And it's a big story. It has a great arc, and I would love to see this one as a TV series. And he's already written one movie called Summering, and in that movie, he said he was like giving all the classics to his daughter, Stephen King, The Mist, and she keeps saying, "Where are all the girls, Dad? Where are all the girls?" So,
Key question.
So he wrote a movie that was quite a bit like Stand By Me, but with all girls.
Wow. And it's called
Summering.
Summering.
So if you're looking for something to
Write that
spin
down.
on your DVD or on your streaming service, that's a good place to start.
Great. And did the film translation of his book hold up with the brilliance of the storytelling?
It was an original screenplay, so it didn't have to compete. He didn't have to compete with himself.
Yeah, because a lot of times with the shows that I'm watching on television, I feel manipulated versus being told a really great story. So I'm excited to hear about some of these books getting translated. So
Yeah.
I have a feeling that you are going to go to our next author. Got that look about you.
And that our next author is actually a pair of authors, Ray Russell and Rosalie Parker. I actually met them. We went on a vacation in to the UK, and we stayed in the village of Thirsk, which is the real place that the fellow who wrote All Creatures Great and Small lived.
Aww.
And we stayed in this wonderful little bed and breakfast, and they had pie specials. It was always a pie night, and we
It's
thought
my kind of place. I'm going to get the address.
and so we were there, and then late at night we decided we'd just take a little walk around the area, and we realized that the doors were locked. We were locked inside, and we're starting to think, where do the pies come from? What's in those pies? But we met the Russells there the next night and had beers with them, and they are the most wonderful couple. They are publishers of the book of Tartarus Press. This is a small press in the UK, and they make the most beautiful books.
As I'm holding it in my hand, it's gorgeous.
They publish lots of horror and horror adjacent works. So if you look up tartarus.co.uk on the web, that is a gold mine of authors that are wonderful and you have never heard of. And the book that we're talking about today isn't exactly a horror book, but it's so unique I had to bring it up. It's called Literary Hauntings, a gazetteer of literary ghost stories. And what this is essentially a travelogue. Most of the entries are one page. They all include a photograph of the place. And these are the places where famous authors and famous ghost stories were set or written, or where they're based on events that happened at these places. And it's an amazing book because in any entry, and there's about 9 writers, so you get a variety of styles, you get a bunch of beautiful pictures of these beautiful, strange houses in the UK, out in the moors and in neighborhoods and old rusted industrial sites. And the authors, each one tells you, in each entry you will get a wonderful summary of the ghost story, a wonderful summary of what the events the ghost story is based on, and some comments on what the place itself is like and how to get there. So if you're in the UK and touring or intending to do so, this is the book for people who love ghost stories because it is delightful. It's also a delight to read because, it's 100 different at least 100 different entries. And you can just pick it up anywhere, read a couple pages, get the gist of a couple great ghost stories, learn about authors, learn about places. It's a total delight.
I just love how people, brilliant people get caught up in an idea or a theme and they just go for it, and then they just open a whole world to us that we get to experience. And I mean, and you said this is a small press, but it's not a small book. It's beautiful, and it's just chock full, like you said, with photos and stories. And I think you have a clip from the authors, right?
Yeah, when we talked to Ray about this very book.
Okay, let's do it.
Well, it really varies because there are some authors who will actually say, 56th Avenue is where the haunting took place. And you can go on Google Earth and you can see it. And that's great. That makes life easy. With Robert Aikman, it wasn't until I was doing the biography of him that I talked to one of his friends who remarked that a particular story had been based on her mother, and she gave me her mother's address. I wasn't quite sure that I ought to actually put the information in, whether this was sort of private or not, but it went into the biography, so it could then be extracted for literary hauntings. So we know exactly where Ravissant is meant to have taken place, even though I think Aikman says it's set in Bruges, isn't it, or somewhere like that. No, it's a particular Muse building in London.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of sort of lateral thinking on that one. Yeah.
Although he says it's Bruges, we know that all those events took place in
really
London,
did take place
in a particular flat.
In a particular flat. And I love hearing their voices. So again, that is Ray Russell and Rosalie Parker talking to you in one of your previous interviews with them.
Exactly. And also they're both authors of great horror stories and novels, and they're some of them are self-published by their press, but most of them are published by other authors. Once you go to Tartarus Press, you will find vast amount of great authors. And let me mention one gal who, in particular, who I think you're all going to hear about. That's Angela Slatter. She started with the book for Tartarus Press called Sourdough, where she created this world called Laudellen. And it's based on kind of the fairy tale idea, but it's very much for adults. The stories are very prickly and complicated, and she's now in her second novel of Laudellen. There's 3 books of short stories and her second novel. And I would say if somebody's looking for the female George R.R. Martin, it's Angela Slatter.
Oh, my.
I mean,
just what I was hoping to find, the female version of George Martin. Well, before we go to our next author, I want to ask you, you've interviewed so many of these horror writers. What's your sense of what inspires somebody to want to live and breathe and write horror?
Well, I think most of them just find the idea of, externalizing things. There are so many things that people are hesitant to talk about: sexuality, religion, belief, faith, all these things, subjects that are kind of prickly. But if you bring them up in a setting where they're replaced or represented by some element of the fantastic, a witch or a monster, some monster from the id, a vampire, zombie. I mean, Clive Barker has a great quote in a book called The Book of the Dead, which is all zombie stories. And what he said was, you want to love the masses, but here they are knocking at your door, and they're faces, ready to eat you.
There is some sense of comfort in externalizing the things that just make us feel so ill inside, all the ills of society, right? And there is just a certain brilliance in that. I thank you for that perspective. Now, are you getting ready to go to our next author?
Yes.
Okay, now before you do, dear listeners, in case you've just tuned in, you are listening to KSQD and KSQT, which is in Prunedale. We are at 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5. This is Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington in the studio with Rick Kleffel, the host of Narrative Species, which you can hear every Friday at 5 p.m. Rick has been interviewing the great writers of the English language for a very, very long time. And we have a treat tonight of exploring the creepy stuff. I should have had my music playing. There we go, during my station ID. We're going to play a little of this music to get some atmosphere going while you introduce us to our next author that we're going to explore.
Our next author is Stephen Graham Jones. He's was first known for his work called The Only Good Indian, and he himself is a full-blooded Indian. He's now working on the 3rd book of the Lake Witch Trilogy. The first 2 books in that series are just so outstanding. He begins with My Heart is a Chainsaw.
What a great title.
and he follows up with the Don't Fear the Reaper. And these books are so much fun. What you get, the main character is Jade, and she knows everything about slasher movies. She is immersed in them, and she's kind of a school outcast. Her father, they live in a small town up in the mountains. There's a haunted lake nearby. The lake was raised over a one-time town, so there's a dead town underneath the lake. There's a nice camp where many killings took place, a day camp for kids. So, you've got your Jason Voorhees mode there, and there are, of course, killings taking place.
Of course.
And there's a local story of the Lake Witch, the Bell Witch, which haunts the lake and haunts the people. And Jade knows all about this. So when she begins to think she's in a slasher movie, she's the one who knows what to do.
I love it. She's a slasher geek.
She's a slasher geek.
Yeah, she knows what to do. That's great.
Now, My Heart is a Chainsaw is, there's lots of observations of our traumatized heroine. You have the taint of the history behind it. There's a group of rich and entitled adults and kids. And, it's just so interesting to get really involved in this small town. Again, you have a bit of a Stephen King vibe, but her character is half Indian. And her father, the town drunk, is the Indian, and her mother is gone. So you get a really interesting look at a small town and the way it works. And the characters and the menace are so great and so well worked out. These books are a joy to read. And actually, I think I did, when I talked to Stephen Graham Jones, I asked him if he would do a separate interview, and I have this on my website. People can hear this. I said, Stephen, I want to do an interview where you tell us about your favorite slasher films that you did to research the book.
What a great idea.
So I think our quote here is, we have a bit from him talking about his what he considers the all-time great, and it won't surprise many people, but it's appropriate.
Okay, here we go.
And I guess I should specify, I think there's two types of slashers. There's the revenge slasher and the mad dog slasher. The mad dog slasher is just like somebody escapes from some holding facility and they like to kill, so they start killing. They don't have a reason for it. They're like, opportunity, I'm going to do it. Whereas there's also revenge slashers, which someone was wronged X amount of time ago, and now they've returned in a mass to exact their revenge, to get what they think is justice. If there is an investigator, it's probably the final girl, but to tell you the truth, the final girl doesn't have a moment like in Psych where Sean Spencer gives a big monologue, or Columbo gives a monologue and, and says, this is why you did it and here's how I caught you. She's too busy trying to fend off a machete or a chainsaw, and it's usually the slasher who does their own revealing, like, this is why I'm doing this. They give like a villain monologue, or we get a villain flashback that stands in for that monologue. So that's the big difference in those old closed door mysteries, or just in any mystery in a slasher, I think. But for like 2/3 of themselves, they're similar. They follow the same beats largely.
Well, I tell you, watching Alien was the end of I was a horror movie fanatic when I was a kid. I watched everything. That did me in, and I never watched another horror film for decades until I decided to watch The Ring all by myself.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that didn't work out well. So now I don't watch horror movies anymore. So any more words on
Stephen Graham Jones?
Stephen Graham Jones, yes.
His favorite, inception point, as it were, of slasher movies is, of course, Halloween. So there you go. And John Carpenter is an influence that casts his influence is cast over the entire genre these days. Most people know his movies and see them. And so when you're reading a lot of horror fiction, if you've seen John Carpenter movies, you'll probably be, right in sync with them. And the Lake Witch trilogy will be completed, I think, early next year, maybe later this year. I know that ARCs of the new book are about. So if you start reading My Heart is a Chainsaw now, by the time you finish Don't Fear the Reaper, you'll find out exactly what happens to Jade Daniels in the third book of the series.
And I bet you really want to. She sounds like a character that really gets into your heart.
Yeah, when he wrote the book, he said originally he wrote the book from the point of view of a young boy. And he said he wrote the book and he gave it to people and they said, well, it's pretty good. And he said, well, that'll never do. And eventually rewrote it with Jade Daniels. And once he got Jade Daniels in, people said they were in. And by the time you read the first book, you really want more of her.
Rick, I remember asking you, how do you read all these books? And you said insomnia. And now that you're like so knowledgeable about all these horror movies, I'm beginning to understand why you can't sleep. So who is our next author?
The next author is Tananarive Due. Now, her work is really interesting. She's worked with a guy I think most people have heard of, Jordan Peele. She wrote episodes for his Twilight Robertson. She's a black woman, and her horror is informed by, current events.
It's not a big leap, is it?
It's not a big leap, although the book I read is called The Wishing Pool. It's a collection of short stories. And one of the things about horror and short stories is that's something that was made in America. The horror genre was born in America by Edgar Allan Poe. And it's an entirely American genre, those short stories. And short stories are still the bread and butter of the horror genre. And they're still quite popular, too. I mean, you can publish books of short horror stories much more easily than a literary or any other kind of collection, because people are familiar with that kind of trope, that the short, sharp shock, as Kim Stanley Robinson.
And we all know how addictive dopamine is. When you're scared, it's like, I got to get another hit of that stuff.
Well, in The Wishing Pool, Tananarive just does such beautiful work, and also really terrifying work. There is a story in there where somebody goes past, just drives past a house and sees a figure, and the way it's cloaked in her language, it is just stone terrifying. I had to put down the book for a moment, which is a rare thing. And she also does a great job of externalizing all the conflicts of her characters. There's a story called The Wishing Pool about, the parents have a lake house out in the country where the dad is now staying, the mother's deceased, the father's going downhill, and the daughter goes out to see the dad. And out behind the house, there's a wishing pool, and she makes a wish, and we all know that's generally not a good idea.
Often isn't.
And she just does a really good job of using the variety in the horror genre, because you can find horror in the big city, out in the country. People get lost. She has a whole city that she calls the Gracetown. It's in northern Florida, and this is where all her horror stories are generally.
Northern Florida?
Yeah.
Somehow I think a lot of us are thinking that works.
Yeah.
Florida seeming a little scary these days.
Exactly. Well, she's got, a town where, the ghosts of Jim Crow are still there, and they're still dangerous. And her work is also just really good. She has a great handle on creating supernatural and also science fiction kind of storylines, where they, again, her characters, because of the inventions of the supernatural or the science fiction, they're able to directly confront the things within them that are holding them back.
That's so psychological, and exactly what we all need to do, to confront those things that are holding us back. So do you have a clip?
Yes, I do.
All right, let's hear it. I'm going to play it now.
Well, it really varies, because there are some authors who will actually say,
well, my late mother, Patricia Stevens Dew, was a civil rights activist who wore dark glasses her whole adult life after the age of 20 because she was tear gassed in 1960, taking part in a nonviolent march. So the horror of history was always in my house. It was the visible scar that she carried from the civil rights movement. So one of the things about that story, Supper Time is the one set in 1909. And the mother is so worried that white men have come, jealous neighbors have come. And when that happened to Black families in 1909, I mean, history is full of those stories. You get burned out, you get lynched, you get vanished. There's very little recourse in the law. So, of course, what's to stop people from just attacking a neighbor who has fatter pigs than they do or a better house than they do? And, a lot of the big racial attacks in history, Tulsa, Oklahoma, for example, were rooted in envy of a thriving community. Same in Rosewood, Florida. Envy of a thriving community turns into false accusations, turns into lynchings and burnings and mass murder. Just horrible, horrible thoughts. So the mother is so relieved that it's a supernatural event and not a lynch mob, which I think says everything you need to know about what it is to be Black in 1909.
And I think that clip says what it is that makes Tanana Riddou's fiction so powerful. She has a new book coming out on Halloween called The Reformatory. It is set in Gracetown, in the Gracetown Boys School for Delinquent Boys. So I'm absolutely looking forward to that, because that is a setting in itself that is, ripe for horror. It's already horrible.
To her saying that it's a relief to deal with the supernatural than, your white community. You're really right. It does say it all. And it reminded me, that she's kind of a collaborator with Jordan Peele. And I'll tell you, that movie, Get Out, it haunted me, because no matter how I played out what could have happened to that protagonist, the ending that we were given was such a positive and hopeful ending. But the way my mind was playing it out was like, there's just no way that could have turned out well for that guy. And it was really haunting. So before we go on to our next author, we're going to take a short break. You are listening to KSQD in Santa Cruz, KSQT Prunedale on 90.7, 89.7, and 89.5. And we will be back with more spooky tales with Rick Kleffel of our narrative species right after this short break.
Spend your Monday night at the Opera on KSQD Santa Cruz. You'll hear the world's greatest singers tell some of the world's most powerful, romantic, funny, and unforgettable stories, all set to the most glorious music ever composed. It's all about drama and being a diva. Monday night at the Opera, 7 to 10 p.m. on KSQD Santa Cruz 90.7 FM.
My name is Luigi Ovido, owner-operator of Pleasure Point Computers and the host of The Computer Man Show, a 1-hour call-in show Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Viruses, slowdowns, scams, and updates. Computers can be a pain, and I'll help you through it.
Send me an email with your request. If it's hardware you want, baby, I'm the best.
If it has an on switch, we'll probably talk about it on The Computer Man Show Tuesdays at 6 p.m. only on KSQD 90.7 FM Santa Cruz.
Get into a computer.
Welcome back to Talk of the Bay. I'm Christine Barrington, and I have in the studio with me Rick Kleffel, Narrative Species, and he is taking us on a whirlwind tour through scary and fabulously written literary horror. And so, Rick, we now get to introduce our listeners to another fabulous writer. Take it away.
Richard Kadrey is a guy who first came known with the cyberpunks, which would have been 20 or 30 years ago, but now he's writing horror, and it's absolutely awesome. His newest book is called The Secrets of Insects. It's out from Subterranean Press, and this brings a little sub-theme to our program, because one of the places that horror has really thrived is in these small individual presses owned by one person or a couple, like Treacherous Press. And Subterranean Press has been around since the 80s, and that's longer than a lot of big chain bookstores and other places have lasted. And they're now associated, with Stephen King. They're publishing limited editions of his books. And his newest book is a collection, again, more following up on this idea of short stories, called The Secrets of Insects. And let me just say, it starts with a story called Ambitious Boys Like You, which finds some unpleasant young men who make a bad series of decisions with regards to that abandoned house one can find on the outskirts of every American city. When they decide to go in, I can't and won't tell you what happens to them. I just can assure you that Richard Kadrey is great at making you think thoughts you wish you would forget, experience events you wish you could banish back into your consciousness, but also at the process of externalization in Kadrey's stories is, might involve something like unzipping bodies. unzipping skin, and it's not a happy experience, but it's also very powerful and very well written. He gets a great brand new Cthulhu mythos. We all know that the Cthulhu mythos invented by H.P. Lovecraft in the 30s, and Lovecraft was he's a big influence right now in all of the horror world and science fiction world, for that matter. And when he created this kind of pantheon of gods, he told all his friends who are also horror writers, well, why don't you guys set some stories there too? And this has been going on now for close to 100 years. God, I can't even believe it. But and Kadri gets in on the action, and his story about the Cthulhu mythos is just absolutely terrifying.
What is the Cthulhu mythos? I've never heard of
mythos.
it. Mythos, thank
okay.
you. See?
It's a religion, sort of, that says there are a series of elder beings. There are interdimensional creatures of godlike powers that come from other universes. The old parallel universe theme, Lovecraft was kind of there first. And these creatures like to break into our universe when the stars are right, or if they can, and consume our souls.
That explains what's going on right now.
Yeah.
The stars aligned and we're in big trouble.
Exactly. Yeah. The old city of Relier out in the Atlantic somewhere has risen, and Cthulhu himself, who is Lovecraft described as a huge, bipedal octopus-headed creature with, tongues and that would consume your soul. His creatures are always somewhat amorphous. His technique, which is really good, is he would tell you that there's this terrible monster out there, and then he'd maybe just show you something that would seem really awful to you, but then he'd say, well, that's just its toenail. So, and leave the idea of leaving the user's imagination, the reader's imagination, let them run wild and scare themselves. And there's also a lovely story in here called What is Love But the Quiet Moments After Dinner? It's a love story between two of the most awful monsters you have ever met. I mean, they are just, I can't even describe them, and that's even counting the Ambitious Boys Like You, which involves also some remarkable invention. But it's so wonderful because while these monsters are, roaming around the showbiz part of LA, I mean,
what a perfect domain for monsters. I'm sorry.
It's true. And they are consuming and killing people just kind of left and right. And most of them are LA types.
They're casual diners.
Yeah, who really deserve it.
So satisfying. It's a satisfying meal.
It is a satisfying meal. And what's nice is that, it's really, he manages to create really horrible monsters, scenes that are really kind of terrifying and awful. And in the end, you feel that it's a very sweet, romantic story. It's a love story.
Oh, that's amazing.
It's really a great example of, working in contrast. Now, our next writer is Cassandra Kaw.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you don't want to play a clip from Richard? Let's hear from him.
Let's hear from Richard,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I love monsters. I grew up with monsters. I mean, I started out watching monster movies as a kid. I started reading Poe and Lovecraft. So I knew monsters were a big part of my life very early on. And as I grew older, I could see how monsters, different kinds of monsters, are just a reflection of humanity. So what monsters you choose, how you use them, how you let them interact with humans or other monsters even, tells a different kind of story each time. And it can reflect different parts of human experience. Even though I'm talking about monsters, human experience seen through the eyes and actions of grotesque beings that are really, in the end, because there aren't monsters, they're all metaphors for ourselves.
He has a wonderful presence in his voice. He seems like somebody that one would love to sit down and just spend dinner with, along with his monsters.
Now, he's the author of a big series, best-selling series called Sandman Slim. Sandman Slim is a demon who's exiled from hell to LA. Hard to tell the difference, and has to deal with a variety of monsters in every book. There's 10 books. If you want to sit down and read a great series, a really well written, they're written as kind of hard-boiled noirs with monsters.
Oh, tell me that it's Sandman Slim.
Sandman Slim.
Richard Kadri.
Richard Kadri. There's 10 of them, and they are really fun. And he's very, very funny. He can be hilarious when he wants to. And in the Sandman Slim books, you'll find he's very hilarious. There's a Sandman Slim novella in this collection where Sandman Slim is given the devil's job. He has to stand in for Satan because Satan needs a vacation. And
he's been reading Terry Pratchett and Mort when Death decides he's going to take a vacation and get an apprentice to do his job. I love that.
It's just hilarious. And it's also a really great, imaginative landscape, a great vision of LA where I used to live. So.
Well, that's a great tip. I need something funny and complex. It's a rich layering that you're describing. That's great.
It's really fun. Now, Richard has started a new series with a writer named Cassandra Khaw. On her own, she is amazing. She's of Malaysian descent, and in our interview, she talked about how her family spirits were an everyday thing in her life.
Right.
So when she writes about spirits, it's very convincing. And she has 2 novellas out, and Nothing But Blackened Teeth and The Salt Grows Heavy. Nothing But Blackened Teeth.
Just the cover of that book is enough to send me running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's a really interesting book because it takes a very classic premise up. A group of people in their 20s who somewhat know each other say they're going to spend the night in a haunted house. But the house is...
Fools.
The house is haunted by Japanese spirits. And she has gone through and done a really deep and intense study of these spirits. And so when they come out, it's really fascinating. I mean, it's like almost a visit to the zoo or something, because each one has its own origin and its own powers and its own appearance. It's really amazing. And against this, the people who are in the house are in so many layers of interpersonal conflict that, the monsters hardly have a chance because the people all, pretend to be friends, but in many ways, everybody hates one other person who's supposed to be a friend. So the complexity, and it's 150 pages. You'll read it one night, and you won't sleep that night.
I was going to say, I'll have insomnia like Rick Kleffel.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. And so, that's what you want art to do. These people are just such high-level writers that you're covering, and they can take us places that these more simplistic forms of entertainment that are just flying everywhere right now can't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because the writers all know that in order to get you to read, you have to care about the people.
Yeah.
And that's the most important part. You really care about that. And I think we have a cut of Cassandra Khaw talking.
Yes, we do. Okay, here we go.
I think most of us run around life going the brain and all you see, that is the whole of it. And we like to pretend that we're kind of solid on the inside, things aren't squishing around. But then everyone goes to the doctor, and no matter how comfortable you are with the doctor, no matter how regular you are with your medical checkup, there's a teeny tiny voice in the back of your head that goes, what if today something wrong happens? And you tense. And I think when you work with horror, it becomes very easy to look at that and to look at people with a kind of tenderness and go, this is where we're all afraid. And the supernatural elements and the gore and everything else is almost to create a background for people where they're willing to address those fears and vulnerabilities. Because they're like, actually, I'm scared of the other thing. But no, it's always a story about human beings. And I think at least that's how I approach horror in my own writing.
Addressing our fears and vulnerabilities. That really is what life gets down to in the nitty gritty, right? Is us like being right on that edge of these things that we don't talk about in polite company, but we deal with at a very deep level.
You know, and Cassandra Khaw and Richard Kadri have a brand new novel out they wrote together called The Dead Take the A Train.
That's a good title.
It's a New York book, I'll tell you. So if you like New York and like the idea of New York being populated with a variety of monsters, this is one of the most monsterific books I've ever read. And they're all really horrible, but what's really great about them is they're all like the most monstrous things being done are being done by human beings. You know, there's a woman who's like hatching a monster inside her daughter to so that the woman can and her other two daughters can live long and profitable lives. And it's the series is the story of Julie Cruz. She's kind of the Buffy the Vampire Slayer type figure who goes around and helps you with if you have a problem with demons or monsters or ghosts or hungry ghosts or whatever else is out there. And there's quite a bit out there. And she has to deal with the firm. In her book, all the hedge fund firms are basically, funded, founded, and run by interdimensional gods along the lines of from the Cthulhu mythos.
That's fantastic. I love it.
It's really fun. It's a fun book. It's a sweet love story between Julie and one of her old friends who comes back to visit her, who's a woman who's lived in a normal life under an abusive husband who later becomes the monster he always was, shall we say.
And the name of that book is again...
The Dead Take the A Train.
The Dead Take the A Train. I'm writing these down. I've got some of these. There's enough humor. The ones that have some humor are the ones I think I can handle.
Yeah. This has a fair amount of humor in it, and it just is nice. It's nice to see somebody like the story. Clearly, is going to take more than one book to tell, but the first book gives you one nice complete story, and it's nice to hit the beginning of a series and say, wow, this is so good. I mean, I could barely put that book down.
I love it. Beautiful. Well, let's move on to, we have about 10 minutes left, and we have a few more people to talk about. Where are we going now, Rick?
We're going to hear from Nick Cutter and Andrew Sullivan. They have a book called The Handyman Method. This is a book about toxic masculinity, essentially. The main characters is a small family, man, wife, and son move into a house. It's a first house in a big suburb. So they're in a big, beautiful house all by themselves. There's something, but not alone.
Plenty of dark corners to project into.
Yes. So let's hear. Now, Nick Cutter is the pseudonym of a literary writer. He decided to go full on body horror. And he's written 3 novels under the name of Nick Cutter. His name is Craig Davidson as a literary writer. But as Nick Cutter, he's written 3 novels. I'm reading one right now called The Troop, about a doomed Boy Scout troop on an island where maybe there's a horrible illness that is going to do awful things to your body. These books scare you from the inside out. And the Handyman Method is no different. The father becomes entranced with a YouTube channel called Handyman Hank. And Handyman Hank mysteriously seems to be speaking just to the main character. And he's telling him to do some very inadvisable things. Let's hear Nick Cutter.
All right.
I mean, from my perspective with horror, it is noticing those little quotidian details, those little aspects of a room, or I think someone once described it as like you come back home to your house and everything looks the same, instead of everything's been moved like an inch to the left. And
the uncanny.
The back of your lizard brain pings like there's something not right here, but everything looks normal. That you're looking for that weird twinge up the back of your neck and sort of passing that on to a reader as best you can. And it's an inexact art. Sometimes not everyone is going to hit. Obviously, you're throwing darts at somebody's sort of psyche and seeing if you can nail a couple. But it's a massively important part of horror. It's not the big operatic set pieces. Sometimes it's the littler things.
It's the small things that get you.
But I can tell you, Nick co-wrote this book, The Handyman Myth, with Andrew Sullivan, and we'll hear from him a little bit later. But Nick is clearly responsible for the scene in this book that you will never forget. It is just so awful and terrifying, and it seems inevitable too, because once it starts, you kind of have an idea of where it's going to go. But he describes it with such incredible literary flair. It's beautiful and horrifying at the same time. And it's also kind of funny. And that takes us to Andrew Sullivan. He has a book called The Marigold. And The Marigold is set in the city of Toronto. And a few years back, the city of Toronto had a mayor called his name was Rob Ford, and he was known for saying everything is fine. And when the city was going to hell, and when he'd be making speeches while he was on crack and drunk, and he was caught with crack, cocaine, and drunk on the job. More than once. He got thrown out but replaced by his brother, who is just as evil but not as stupid.
Even worse.
In The Marigold, it begins with somebody starting to build a new skyscraper, The Marigold, and the way they do this in Toronto is to they bury a blood sacrifice in the bottom beneath the.
Always the essential component of a good foundation.
Exactly. The problem is that there's something called the wet. The wet is a fungal rot that's growing up into the underneath of buildings under Toronto and changing them. And it doesn't just change the building. It doesn't just grow on things. It might grow inside of you if you breathe some of those spores. And where this, I won't say where this.
We're back to Alien again.
I won't say where this book goes, but it goes farther than you could imagine. And there is the most wonderful character in here, a character named Cabeza. Cabeza, when you read The Marigold, you will love Cabeza. Cabeza is hilarious. And let's hear Andrew Sullivan now. This is him talking about being a handyman himself for the handyman method. And this is, you'll see why I love Andrew Sullivan.
And then later I had bats.
Oh my God.
Who came down my old chimney, and I was playing video games at 2 a.m. and then I had a bat flying around me. And the video game I was playing was Bloodborne, so it has vampires and like werewolves in it. And I'm playing, and then this bat is flying around me, and I'm like, is this 3D? Like, what's going on?
Am I super high?
Yeah, did I take too many drugs before? No. And then I go upstairs, right? This is you're gonna like this, Rick. So I'm like, okay, I gotta get rid of this bat. So I go upstairs, I put on a parka and I put on oven mitts because you can't touch them, right? Like if they have rabies, you're screwed. And I go upstairs, it's 2 a.m. and my wife's in the bathroom, and I open the bathroom door and I'm wearing a parka and oven mitts, and I'm grab a towel, and I was like, we have got a bat in the basement. And she was like, oh, I married a writer. Like, he finally went insane. Okay. What do I do now? Like, she was just like, all right, so he's cracked. I go to the basement. I knock the bat down with a towel. It like lands in a hat on the floor. I take it outside. I throw it in the air, and it just flies away like nothing. So those things also influence the book. They're when you're up at 2 a.m. and, you know, trying to avoid thinking about work the next day, and a bat's like, "Hey, do you want a new problem? Do you not have enough going on in your life right now?" The idea that your home, you know, is never like, you can't airtight seal it because you know, suffocate. You like, there's always going to be some way for something, whether it's a bug or an animal or a YouTube video, to get inside your house. And it's not like a place that's always protected. It is a place that like is permeable, stuff can get in, and you have to determine like what level you're used to. And my wife, almost with the squirrels, was like, "They're not hurting anyone." I was like, "They are hurting me."
Stuff gets in.
It does.
We're always permeable. Well, and speaking of stuff getting in, so we have about a minute and a half left. So I want you to hit what's important, which I think is this author that's coming to Bookshop Santa Cruz. Yeah,
we have coming to Bookshop Santa Cruz this Wednesday. We're so fortunate because Bookshop Santa Cruz is so far up in the American bookstore hierarchy. We're getting Jacqueline Woodson. She is the author of A Brown Girl Dream, which won a National Book Award, and she's won the MacArthur Genius Prize. She's won so many prizes I don't have time to list them. She has a brand new book. It is so beautifully written. It's called Remember Us. It's set in the summer when she lived in Brooklyn, and there are a bunch of people just setting fires in all the houses in her neighborhood. Now, she fictionalized the story, but it's really fascinating. It's beautifully told from the point of like a 12-year-old girl who's just, you know, on the cusp of growing up. It's fantastic, and I have a little bit of audio from her.
Great, let's play this.
Right. So it is actually fiction, except for the part that's true, which is the part about the fires in Bushwick. I made up all the characters. I made up Sage. I made up her dad, her mom, and I set it in a real time. And I wanted to do it that way because I did want to talk about the fires of Bushwick during the 70s, but I also, you know, I write fiction, and I didn't think just telling that story was going to do the story justice unless there was a world created around that story that wasn't the world specifically that I grew up in.
So that's Jacqueline Woodson coming to Bookshop Santa Cruz Wednesday, right?
6 p.m.
Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Be there. She is really interesting. She has a fascinating life story to tell, and she's an amazing storyteller. Her language is just beautiful. She's a poet.
Beautiful. Well, Rick, thank you so much for this horror tour de force. I'm going to actually read some of these books, and I don't like being scared, but you have convinced me with your great storytelling. Thanks again for joining us on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here.